Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Directors Forum on this snowy follow-up to what was a pretty remarkable evening for all of Washington, D.C., and I guess you're our bold and our brave who've made it through all the turmoil and have joined us here this morning. So thank you. A double welcome to you. We had an awful lot more acceptances to this. A lot of interest was expressed. So I think we'll have people coming in through the course. But welcome. This is, of course, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm Steve McDonald, the director of the Africa program here and the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity. We welcome you to the center. I think you all know the center is the living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, where we like to bring together the world of ideas and the world of policy. And today's no exception. We are really honored to have the Special Representative of the Secretary General and the head of MONUSCO from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Roger Meese, here with us. You have the bio for Roger. Very little is needed in his introduction. He's a remarkable Foreign Service officer with a series of experience that has made him a true expert on the Congo, having served as a deputy ambassador there, then head of the Central Africa Bureau under whose responsibility Congo comes, and then as the ambassador there prior to his retirement. And as he tells me, he failed at retirement when the United Nations came to seek him out for this position. So he's a dismal failure at retirement, but I think he does well at everything else. So it's really a wonderful for us to have Roger, who's an old friend, here today. I sometimes do a lengthy scene setter, but I won't do that today. You know the subject and the focus of Roger's talk. He is going to stay with us after he finishes his formal remarks for questions and answers. We have a crowd here of people who pretty well know the Congo and have good backgrounds, so you don't need me to tell you any of the challenges that face that country. Obviously, the coming elections in the Congo probably rank with the just finished referendum in Sudan as two of the major events of Africa this year that will affect millions and millions of people in their outcome and in their implementation. And therefore, the Congo is very much on our minds as we look towards those elections. And of course, it's a country with huge potential, probably one of, or the possibly most vibrant economies on the continent if everything were going right there. So we all wish it well, care deeply about it, and are just very lucky to have Roger here with us this morning. With no further ado, I'll turn it over to Roger.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming. I sometimes think of those of us who work in the Congo as being the hardcore, hardy survivors, but I think anybody who is braving the Washington winter this morning, you get to rank yourselves in the same category. So I appreciate you braving the elements. We just got in last night from New York, and it was a bit of a challenge getting to the hotel from Union Station as well. But thanks to the Wilson Center as well for putting this together. I was asked to talk primarily. There's lots of things, of course, about MONUSCO, about Congo that merit discussion. I was asked to talk about peace consolidation and elections primarily. As you can see, I've got a title slide that perhaps is reminiscent of who put the S in MONUSCO with stabilization. And the word stabilization is something that was added, of course, to the mission name by Resolution 1925 last year. It covers a wide variety of things. In some ways, you can think of peace consolidation and stabilization in some ways being synonymous terms, and I think it might be worth talking a little bit about. Stabilization the addition and what it means and how MONUSCO is doing it has generated a good deal of discussion, and properly so, especially given the conditions under which Resolution 1925 was adopted last year, at the time with a great deal of uncertainty about the future of MONUC, given the position that was taken by President Kabila and the government at the time, that they had essentially wanted MONUC withdrawn from the country by mid-2011 or during the course of the year. I think we've put to rest a lot of that uncertainty and certainly have an improved relationship with the government but there's still a valid and ongoing discussion about what does stabilization mean, how does it fit in with what we're doing, how does it work, and what does this mean relative to peacekeeping. So perhaps let me just speak a few minutes about that. I would submit to you that stabilization, or peace consolidation if you prefer, is an integral part of peacekeeping. I think it has to be an essential part of how we approach peacekeeping. Traditional peacekeeping, in terms of, in Congo's case certainly, addressing armed groups, protecting civilians, trying to establish conditions of security, is obviously a priority. The civilian of protections is our highest priority in the mission. But to get to long-term success, you have to create conditions of long-term stability, of security that is self-sustaining. And so I think you have to talk about stabilization within that context. So I would submit that stabilization, although the name was only added and a more formal recognition of it in MONUSCO with a resolution last year, but it is in fact an integral part of what we need to talk about, not only in Congo but elsewhere. And indeed, when talking about peacekeeping, I've already mentioned what you need to get, and perhaps I would define long-term success, is a self-sustaining, stable environment. In other words, the kinds of conditions where you no longer need a major military, UN, or other peacekeeping presence. Peacekeeping and conflict situations that require peacekeeping obviously have lots of different kinds of conditions, lots of different contexts, and indeed many of the arguments and discussions going on about Iraq and Afghanistan incorporate a lot of the same ideas and themes. For today, however, I'm going to confine my specific remarks to the Congo situation. I would submit, however, a lot of the ideas could be more broadly applied. And in any of those, though, I would submit long-term stabilization, long-term peace consolidation must be an essential component of how you are defining the mission and how you are getting to ultimate success. Stabilization, certainly in Congo's case, has been very much a changing target in terms of how people think of it. I was part of at least some of the discussions early on that led to the establishment of what was then MONUC, the peacekeeping presence. So I know that at the time we really were talking about how do we end active conflict? How do we get the formal withdrawal of foreign armies? Stabilization at that time, we really were thinking in very short term, in terms of just trying to get to some kind of environment that you could start working with a situation to fill in, to create conditions. That was not long-term stabilization. That was very much an urgent, crisis-driven intervention to try to put an end to fighting. And I think that was largely what characterized MONUC and thinking of MONUC at the time. At the risk of digressing a bit, I think of a discussion when I was there as ambassador with several colleagues in the very long time we spent together in what was then the CIAT, the International Committee to Accompany the Transition. Some of my colleagues were going on at some length about we need to do more to try to promote good governance and good practices. And I, at one point, I remember making an intervention saying, you know, what we really need to perhaps start with is just trying to ensure governance. Then maybe we can move on to good governance. But in many ways, it was just getting the basics in place. As MONUC developed and the capital T transition was established out of the Sun City Accord, leading eventually to what were the 2006 elections. Originally, the goal were 2005 elections. Stabilization started taking on a different kind of meaning. People started looking at the end of the transition as the goal, as the point of success, as the end product, and indeed many, particularly those perhaps who are more focused on budget issues, started thinking about the 2006 elections and a successful end to the transition as being the exit strategy for MONUC. I never accepted that thinking. The 2006 elections, with all their importance, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, was not the end game. It was, in my opinion, a vital important, critically necessary milestone and step toward creating the basis that you could get to solutions. It was not a solution in and of itself. And certainly I think the history since 2006 has demonstrated that did not provide the basis that the Security Council, I think, itself recognized in providing an exit strategy for MONUC. That was not stabilization in terms of, again, what I defined earlier as a self-sustaining, stable environment for the long term. As the 2006 elections were held, and as Steve mentioned, I think widely viewed as successful, free, fair, credible, not perfect, but certainly a valid election exercise, particularly in the very difficult context of the Congo. I think then a lot of people started giving more serious thought to what is it we need to do to create that stable environment, a secure environment, something that permits the country to succeed on its own without the necessity of having a UN or other major foreign presence to keep it going. And I think that discussion is now more fully engaged and certainly was advanced in the discussions that led to the adoption of 1925 last year, and in terms of how we think of stabilization or peace consolidation now. What is stabilization, or at least how I think of it? Well, I think, in my opinion, it includes a number of components. Obviously, it has to start with security. You need minimally satisfactory security conditions for any kind of stable environment to be achieved. As long as we have significant numbers of armed groups running around in the East with a major capability of threatening civilians and threatening the stability of the area, we are not going to achieve stability for the Congo as a territory. Clearly, there are differences, and again, I'll mention this a bit more, between different parts of the country. That's part of the nature of the Congo and its size. But you have to have, however you define it, minimally adequate conditions of security to be able to talk about long-term stability. Governance issues, and I would put elections as a part of that, clearly are a component that you need for stabilization and long-term stability, and that too has to be a central part of what we are doing along with other international partners and all of those who are engaged in activity in the Congo to achieve success. And the third I would mention is economic opportunity, or economic development, if you will. A lot, perhaps in peacekeeping, don't like to talk about economic development as such, perhaps because it remains the domain of UNDP and other specialized agencies within the UN family, but economic development has to be a critical part as well. I wonder how many of the Congolese armed groups that exist in the East would not exist if, in fact, there were ample economic opportunities for those combatants to have pursued in something other than picking up a gun and finding a way to make a living. And these things all interrelate to each other. More favorable security conditions help promote economic development. The economic development helps provide the stable conditions. Good governance clearly is a key factor interrelated with all of these. So these are all components and they all interrelate. And as far as I'm concerned, that's part of what needs to be done. The photo, by the way, that's here is a picture of an Indonesian engineering company that is part of MONUSCO building a road. And I use it to exemplify the interrelationship here, because this road in particular that they're working on is a road that runs from Dungu to Faraje, which, for those who are familiar with the geography, unfortunately I don't have a map, is up in the northeastern portion, not all that far from the Sudanese border. It's a very inaccessible area. This road is particularly critical and was originally starting to be developed related to the LRA activity and the necessity for security-driven considerations to address that threat. It can become even more critical depending on how South Sudan develops and the relationship there. But the road obviously also has a major economic impact. And in turn, as you develop roads, as we've already discovered, and you promote traffic and commercial traffic, that has a beneficial impact on security conditions. It's all part of the package together. But these are the Indonesians building that road. They're very active. They're very dynamic. When I made my first visit up there, they basically kidnapped me and took me out, saying, "You have to see our road." And thank you. And they're doing a good job with it. Then we come to, under governance and a particular category, elections. The picture, by the way, is from the 06 campaign period, and it's probably too small to see, but among the hundreds of candidates, you may be able to make out, maybe not over here, but over here there's a banner for a legislative candidate that says vote for number 362. But elections, the 2006 elections, in my opinion, most analysts and most observers that I have seen or talked to probably underestimate the impact of the 2006 elections. Not only, in my opinion, did it create a successful end to the somewhat dysfunctional transition period, but it radically changed the way that politics and governance is practiced in the Congo, and this is still an unfolding picture in terms of how things are developing. But it set up a very different dynamic than what had traditionally been the case, dating back from the colonial period through the Mobutu dictatorship, and indeed the earlier days of the ADFL, Laurent Kabila, and that model. It just starts to establish some competing centers of influence in the form of still very weak but provincial assemblies, in the form of a national assembly that does not automatically line up and salute when party chiefs give their orders. It starts to set up a dynamic of accountability to electors that Congolese politicians at varying speeds and at different degrees of success are starting to internalize. But it's made a huge difference, and I can see it very visibly, having worked there certainly in the days of '95 and the Mobutu period, in the days of the war, and certainly what's going on now. It's very easy for me to see that difference and the way that at least many people are thinking about things. So I cannot overestimate the importance of the '06 elections as a milestone and as an achievement on several levels. Now, of course, we're coming up on the second round of national elections for 2011. This is important to continue. What I've already mentioned was starting to be put in place by the 2006 elections. In my view, they are also absolutely critical to maintain the legitimacy and the authority of state institutions. And I have had very senior Congolese, including the president, say that to me in basically those terms. We recognize that we have to have credible elections to maintain the legitimacy of the state. And if you think about that, a different way of phrasing that is these are of critical importance basically to safeguard all of the progress that has been achieved, at least since the transition. So I think these elections are of major and critical importance to be credible, to be successful. I don't think they are going to be perfect. Of course, I'm not sure there are perfect elections any place, and I won't digress on that topic, but they are important to be held and to be viewed as a valid, democratic, credible election exercise. The good start has been made for the 2011 elections. The planning has gone forward, timetables in place, a logistics plan, a credible budget that is reasonable, roughly, by the way, and there's been a lot of confusion about this. The budget for the 2011 elections is on the order of about $240 million. A lot of people have heard a figure of $700 million plus. In my opinion, the Election Commission made a serious tactical error, apparently with the active encouragement of the international community, talking about the $700 million figure, which is a figure that in fact covers a multi-year segment all the way from the 2006 elections to the projected local elections in 2013. It is not the cost of the 2011 elections, and I don't think that was the wisest move, but that is not the figure. It's roughly $240 million. If you start from an assumption base of about 31 million voters, that's versus the roughly 25 million who voted in 2006. Work that out on any kind of per capita basis. It's a reasonable figure in line with what is you see in other countries in Africa and other situations. The government is committed to covering about 60% of that cost, up from, by the way, 10% in 2006. Various donors have pledged money. things are moving forward. Voter registration has gotten underway. The MONUSCO role, as authorized by Resolution 1925 and as specifically requested by the government, is to provide essential logistical support, and indeed in many cases we have unique capabilities within MONUSCO and the mission to do so, and we are fully committed to doing that. Indeed, we have already been very active. We've moved already in excess of 2,600 tons of electoral material, primarily related to the voter registration exercise at this point. There is a logistics plan in place, and obviously this support is going to increase significantly as we move closer to the actual date. The projected election date is late November for the national elections. But we are very much committed, recognizing both the importance of the elections and the need for our support. We have budget issues ourselves, and this is a difficult period internationally and within the UN to find the resources. But I have assured the government and can reiterate here that we are fully committed to doing what we can. The elections are not going to be easy. Elections in Congo, for all of you who have tracked or are familiar with the country, is a difficult proposition. The lack of infrastructure, the inability to access a lot of places other than by helicopter. There has been no national census conducted since the 80s, and nobody really has a firm idea other than extrapolated from data collected during the voter registration in 2006. Enormous organizational and logistical complexities. Being an active member of not only the CIAT but the Election Steering Committee in 2006, I have a pretty good understanding of many of these. I told several people that I learned a lot more about organizing elections in 2006 than I ever wanted to know. But I do not want to use the word sanguine, but I am comfortable with the state of election planning and the progress that has been moving forward. I have to say, however, that the election calendar that leads to a projected date of late November is an extremely tight calendar that has virtually no room for maneuver. And if anything goes wrong in that, logistical, technical problems, it will be very easy for dates to slip. So nobody should be under any illusions that this is an automatic process. Although the 2006 elections were successful with lots of international support, the 2011 exercise is still a difficult exercise, and any elections in a country the size of Congo and where the difficulties are going to be difficult. But it is doable. The donor support and engagement is there. The Election Steering Committee, composed of senior Congolese ministers and foreign donors, is active, present. Our planning is going forward, and this certainly can be done. And I think we've got a good start in doing so. Again, I cannot overemphasize the importance, in my view, of having these elections. I think a failure to do a credible and valid election exercise this year would be disastrous relative to the whole long-term program and stabilization and the interests of peace in the Congo. And we do have the lessons of 2006, and it is easier to do than in 2006. We were inventing everything from scratch in 2006. There was no constitution, there was no idea of how to vote, there was no idea of how to set it up, organize, do any of it. And at least we have the lessons from that and can draw from that to do it. Again, at the risk of digressing, but as a anecdote, these hundreds of candidates in Kinshasa for the legislature was creating a real challenge for designing a ballot in 2006. You had to have not only the name of the candidate, but photos, logos, if there was an appropriate logo for a party, the number, various things. And how do you do that in a manageable ballot for 600 to 700 candidates in each voting district on a ballot to make it something that can be used? Vote for one. And I remember the experts finally coming unto us and saying, okay, this is the best we can do in terms of a ballot. And they presented us these poster-sized sheets of paper. There would be 6 or 7 pages per ballot. of candidates and vote for one. And I think all of us looked at that with some dismay, but without any ideas of how to do it better. And I recall making a comment at the time, something along the lines of, I could accept it and clear it, but I would be very happy that I didn't have to explain this ballot to the voters of Broward County. Nonetheless, and watching on voting day itself how people struggled with this monster ballot, but did so very studiously and with great interest to vote was a very encouraging and positive development as well. But again, we have lots of lessons, practical ones and other ones. Another anecdote, we neglected to think of light sources in the electoral kits. And I remember sitting with a group counting votes after the polls closed, and it got turned into a counting center in a station I went to, and I found everybody sitting in total darkness because there was no electricity. We had failed to put in light sources to the voter kit. They looked to me as the international observer, and they said, "What do we do? By the way, there's a light source in the street light nearby. We can move outside and sit under the street light and count votes, but that's against the rules. We're supposed to stay here." I said, "Look, I mean, you can't count votes here. I can't even see you, much less count votes." So we moved everything outside. Lesson learned, marked down, put in light source for future election kits to count votes. Stabilization, overall, including the elections. I allude here to the old saw about a camel is a horse designed by committee. I think stabilization is a particularly mutant form of camel. It is difficult. It looks awkward. It is composed of lots of competing forces. Within the UN alone, I'm sure as all as you know, we have lots of UN agencies operating in the Congo. Keeping everybody in sync, oriented, and coordinated is a major part of our effort, as a part of one UN, but it's not easy. And indeed, speaking in my past capacity as U.S. ambassador, there is a parallel issue with U.S. government agencies trying to keep everybody in sync. This is not the easiest task, just in-house within the respective organizations, whether it be U.S. government, UN, or others. Then you have to coordinate with other donors and other international partners, each of whom have their own priorities, directives from home, and different ways of thinking and approaching things that makes it that much more complicated. Then add in NGOs, various interest groups, and others who have their own issues and agendas and advocacy that they are pushing, and it makes it very difficult. And of course, let us not forget, which I think we too often do, the government. The government is obviously critical. It is their country. And if we are talking about long-term stability, it is ultimately going to rest with the government. It is their responsibility. That is how you have long-term stability, is a functioning government that is able to function and respond to its citizens' needs. And we have to be cognizant of that. We have to work with that. That is indeed part of the long-term solution. And that too has its challenges and problems. And related to that, let me also comment a bit of a pet theme of mine. I think that all of us are too often not sufficiently cognizant of domestic political contexts and environments and stresses and issues. There are things that the outside observer could come into the Congo and say, logically, clearly this is what should happen, and it's not happening. And to get to the answer, you can often find it in domestic political forces, regional economic groups, whatever it might be, but basically politics. This is not unique to Congo. It's true everywhere. In this city, in Washington, D.C., I would dare say, there are lots of objective external observers who would come in and say, logically, this is an obvious thing the U.S. should be doing in policies in Washington, but they aren't happening. Why is that? Politics. We have to take into account the local political environment in terms of how we're working and what we're doing, because otherwise we're ignoring the basic realities that is very much a part of life for the government, for any government. And it is something that I think too often we don't either understand or take enough account of in terms of our own thoughts, our own recommendations, and our own approaches. So to summarize a lot of this, to reach effective peace consolidation, to reach effective stability, we have to the maximum extent possible, integrate all of these various elements. The economic part of it, the security conditions part of it, the governance and elections and political context part of it, to have an effective strategy and an effective approach. This is particularly complicated, I think, in a country like Congo because you have wildly varying conditions present in different parts of the country. In North and South Kivu, in Ituri district, in Bawede with the LRA, you still have active armed groups that create a major challenge and are the focus of our MONUSCO military forces. In Western Congo, whether it be Equateur, Bas-Congo, or elsewhere, you have major humanitarian issues, major challenges for economic development, major other problems, but they are of an entirely different nature. And somehow you have to concurrently address these different issues and different ways of approaching things and different ways of doing things at the same time that is appropriate for those areas and responding to the appropriate challenges. And by the way, one of the things that we are experimenting with in MONUSCO is in 3 of the western provinces replacing the traditional MONUSCO head of office with something that probably will bear the title of area coordinator. But this person will fulfill the functions of a traditional MONUSCO head of office, but come from one of the UN specialized agencies. And the idea here is to try to maximize our ability as MONUSCO and as the UN on an integrated approach to implement our programs and activities in a more effective way relative to the stabilization agenda in Western Congo, which is a different scenario than Eastern Congo. In the East, though, in the Kivus, for example, stabilization also remains an important priority, but it also obviously has to be in the context of what is a significant ongoing security challenge with military operations, with the armed groups and so on. So different things in different places, but always to be as integrated as possible and working as much as possible in harmony with other partners. The varying stages and models I've already referenced. We obviously have to be aware at all times where we are at, what is happening, and tailor the approaches as appropriate, and again, particularly so in a country as large and diverse as the Congo with the varying conditions. And I would submit to you that over time, there has been huge progress achieved. If you think of where the country was at 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, or choose your time frame, even 5 years ago, there has been a huge amount done. A long road has already been traversed. I think about, for myself, coming back after a few years, it's perhaps easier for me to see that. I sometimes say something like this to people who have just arrived in country, and of course they look at me as if I'm nuts. But in point of fact, it's true. But the issues and the problems that are affecting us and that affect the Congo are not short-term, quick 6-week kinds of quick solutions. They require a long-term sustained engagement. I would assert to you that that road is being followed. We are continuing to follow it. Much has been done, and much more can be done and will be done, in my opinion, if we stay on track. There is no guarantee of it, but it is certainly doable. And it is my commitment, and indeed the reason I chose to leave retirement and take this posting, because I think it is doable. I am not aware that I have any masochistic tendencies. I would not have returned to the Congo if I thought it was a doomed effort. I think that it is, as I say, a very long road has been traversed, and I think we can and certainly have all the possibility of continuing to move forward, and it's important that we do so. But I have said to the Security Council, and I will say again, it needs a continuing and sustained engagement from the international partners as well as from the Congolese themselves. With that, I will leave you. At one point, I had a map of the logistics plan that somehow has dropped out of the slide somewhere. And it's just a map of the Congo that gives you an Excedrin headache with hubs and lines running all over the place as part of our logistics plan for how things are implemented. I regret that somehow has disappeared thanks to the magic of modern technology. But I thank you very much. I thank you for the opportunity of speaking today and for being here. And as mentioned earlier, I'll be happy to listen to questions and refer any difficult ones to somebody else. So, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that informative and very thoughtful presentation. Before we start in the question session, I'm going to do something. I'm sure Roger will join me in this because I would have said this in the beginning, but he came in late. But I want to recognize Howard Wolpe in the audience, my predecessor in this position, a known Congolese expert. I don't think he needs much introduction to the crowd, but welcome, Howard. You've been away for a while. It's very good to see you again.
Congratulations on braving the roads to get here.
You all know the rules. When I recognize you for a question, wait till the microphone gets there. And even though you may know Roger very well, do introduce yourselves because we're being webcast live and the rest of the world wants to know who you are. Okay, so we'll begin. First question here.
Thanks, Steve. Ed Barber from Good Works International, Andrew Young's consulting firm. And welcome, Mr. Ambassador. I wanted to ask about the government's writ when it comes to elections. We're all familiar with the weakness of their control in the Kivus. You talked about the infrastructure deficiencies. I flew across northern Congo once from Nigeria to Tanzania and was flabbergasted at how little you could see, how few signs of human activity you could see from 30,000 feet. So the question is, when you're talking about elections, are these...
It's amazing how little activity you see from a helicopter flying right over the trees.
Good. Reinforces my point. So the question is, when you are talking about elections, are these mostly elections in the big cities? How far can you get into the countryside, and how?
Thank you for the question. Are we answering one, or are you taking several?
Go for it, then we'll bundle them after this. No, I didn't announce
I didn't check the format. Let me try to answer briefly, though. You're quite right. I mean, there's vast stretches of the Congo where you fly and you don't see anything. And I mentioned earlier, lots of places where you cannot access other than by helicopter. There is, believe it or not, some surface access to various points now that were not the case in 2006. There has been progress, but there's still a lot. I mentioned before, roughly 25 million people voted in 2006. One cannot say with any certainty what percentage of the eligible population because there's been no census. But the feeling is that was a pretty significant percentage, and certainly voter turnout was very high. There is a very active effort that went on then and now to reach all areas, even quite remote. And this include helicopters bringing people in, doing the necessary both for registration and election. So, no, it is not just an exercise in the major cities. And certainly there is a very active objective and effort conducted both in the past and as a part of the present exercise to reach every place to the maximum extent possible. Is that going to be perfect? Obviously not. But my sense is not bad. And if you use if you work very crude figures of reasonable estimates of the overall population, add another assumption of what is clearly a very young demographic in terms of the percentage of the population that's younger than 17 and thus not eligible to vote, you're getting up into fairly respectable percentages in terms of both the 25 million figure in 06 and the projected 31 million this year. So. There were, in 2006, there were not only helicopters and cars, but boats, bicycles, everything being used to get materials out and conduct the elections.
Okay, thank you. Okay, right down here. And we will take 3 questions, then respond.
Noted.
Thank you, Ambassador. John Elliott from Human Rights Watch. Good luck in your new role, and thank you for your presentation. I was a little bit disappointed not to hear mention of justice and the need to address problems from Congo's past, because, of course, they influence many of the problems, particularly in the East at the moment. And I've struggled to get a clear answer as to why people like Bosco Ntaganda have not been arrested. Could you explain to me why not?
Okay. And I saw him
Three questions.
right here in the middle. Yes, the young lady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I'm Rachel Strom from Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I was wondering, given the recent changes to the Constitution, where any candidate with a plurality of votes after a single round of voting may retain the presidency, which obviously works strongly in Kabila's favor, to go back to your point, you made an important point about the legitimacy of these elections being enormously important for continued progress. So prognosticating perhaps a year in advance, do you believe that given this change, the majority of the Congolese people will still view these results as legitimate given their the disadvantage they pose to opposition parties?
Okay, and then, yes, right in front, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Carol Kramer, independent consultant. But my question has to do with the local elections that we're supposed to follow on the national elections. So if you could please talk about those a bit. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. That's a long
Thank you. All excellent questions, and all of these are areas that deserve considerable treatment in their own right. I, of course, was given very strict orders to try to confine the time I spoke, and I have a tendency to speak for too long, so I was not covering what are, in fact, a number of very important points in this particular presentation. The human rights situation is obviously one of major ongoing concern. It's a complicated subject. It's one that deserves a considerable discussion and presentation in its own right. I won't try to explore all aspects of that here. The issues posed by the various armed groups is something in and of itself. Problems created by government forces is another topic. The relative weakness of military and civilian justice systems is a critical issue, one that I have and will intend to be reiterating in forthcoming presentation to the Security Council. Encouragement for all partners to the extent possible to not just sustain but increase their assistance in terms of building capabilities of Congolese justice systems, which are also part of the governance agenda and long-term stabilization. You asked specifically about Bosco in Uganda, the head of this de facto head of the CNDP. There's a separate political president of the CNDP, which operates somewhat differently. The CNDP is a particularly, for those who are not familiar with the acronym CNDP, the CNDP is a party now, but it's also a component that to a significant degree consists of people, officers and military who came out of the legacy of the old ANC, the armed part, the army of the RCD in the East. They pose a particular challenge. They operate as a quasi-autonomous force, although ostensibly integrated into the FARDC, the Congolese National Army. What I could charitably say is that is an incomplete process, and Bosco in particular is his own force and is not really an integrated part of the FARDC command structure. And therein creates the problem as well in terms of how do you move effectively in terms of addressing Bosco or other individuals in practical terms to be able to do it, and even if you are able to do it without destabilizing or setting off a large-scale destabilization, in this case in North Kivu where he is based. In Uganda, for those who may not know, is also under an ICC, International Criminal Court warrant for arrest, indictment, I should say. We do not deal or work with him in any way. It would be nice to see the kinds of conditions where the government had the full capabilities of imposing its will, imposing order, including effective moves against Bosco or others who are guilty of serious abuses, human rights and other violations. But to be frank, that's not yet the case, and therein lays the major constraint. It is an active part and a difficult part of the agenda in creating the necessary conditions of stability and order, particularly in the Kivus, where the CNDP operates, and it's one that is very important. There are lots of different discussions, including how to further the integration process or other actions as to how to do that. That's, again, a somewhat different discussion. I don't think we have the time to pursue all of that here, but it's a very important one. And it is one that is not only preoccupying us, MONUSCO, and the international community more broadly, but I can say with very full confidence that it is one that is preoccupying Congolese government leadership as well. I'm sorry, there were two more questions.
More questions.
Single round of voting. Obviously, this was recently adopted. It was very controversial. It came about as I think a political calculation by the presidential forces that the opposition would not be able to unify or rally around a single candidate, and that's why it is viewed as being beneficial to the president and the presidential election component. Interestingly, a group of opposition leaders collectively called it MONUSCO. I was not there. I was here in the U.S. recently, and said they could live with a single round, which I found mildly surprising, but that was their position. We'll have to see how this develops. It was done in accordance with the legal provisions of the Constitution that was adopted in 2005-2006, in terms of amending the Constitution, in terms of providing for the voting changes. Certainly it is possible to have credible elections with a single round. There's nothing inherent in a single round per se conceptually, but it is a change in the way that the elections were viewed in 2006. To me, the critical question that is related is the conditions that prevail in terms of allowing candidates, opposition, and others to be able to function, to speak, campaign, operate in a reasonably free and transparent and credible manner, with all the related questions of media access and so forth. Those are all very important, of course, in terms of providing for a credible election exercise. The related question, if you will, of local elections, those were supposed to be held shortly after the 2006 elections. My own sense is that after the trauma of getting through the transition and holding the 2006 elections, the political class of the Congo collectively went and promptly forgot about everything else they were supposed to be doing, including the establishment of the permanent national independent election commission to replace the transition era independent election commission, much less the local elections, which may have gotten tied in a bit as well to some of the decentralization agenda. And so they were never held. I think it is very important. They are now projected for 2013 under the current scenario. I think it'll be very important, and a message that I certainly have been stressing in discussions. Clearly it is important to hold the credible national elections, as I was mentioning, but it is also important to move to the local elections projected for 2013 following these elections, and to hold those as well. And I am not alone in expressing that view, and I think it is something that it is important to continue to stress at all levels.
Good. Thank you. Okay, we're right in the back there, the blue shirt. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Just a couple of questions about...
And you are?
I'm sorry. I'm Brian Stout with USAID, though this question is not in my official capacity. Just wanted to hear you speak a little bit to what you see as the greatest threats to stability around the elections. Thanks.
Okay, and yes, right beside him there almost.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador, for your presentation. Sasha Lezhnev from the Enough Project. I think we see security sector reform as something critical to achieving stability in the East and in the country at large, particularly when people like Bosco and Ntaganda are still operational commanders in the operations. And this is something that Mr. Wolpe and EU Ambassador Roland Vandegeer worked very hard on last year. So wanted to ask for your assessment of kind of where you think security sector prospects, security sector reform prospects for this year lie, particularly given that the old MANUC, used to have the old coordination mandate for this, and so how we can help move this forward. That's very important for us too. Thank you.
Okay, did I see one other hand? Oh yeah, right here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, sir. My name is John Jackson. I'm African liaison for the Universal Negro Improvement Association. There's concern among some Congolese that Kabila is anxious about the next elections, and that he might take actions to prevent or delay. Would you assess the possibilities of the Kabila party?
Okay.
Sure. Thank you. Again, all very important questions. There are two election-related questions. Let me try to address together. I don't, in my own judgment, in the universe of possibilities, anything is possible. But I would not view threats to stability to the country arising out of elections as among my chief concerns. Clearly, there is the prospect for increased tensions associated with campaigning and elections. There are lots of issues, particularly in the East, that can become involved, and certainly other localized situations that can be of particular concern. But I don't see, in 2006, for example, we were talking about the holding of elections in a context where you had three major and relatively hostile armies coexisting with each other in the country. That condition doesn't exist anymore. It is not as though all is resolved, as we were mentioning earlier, the CNDP and so on, but we don't have that kind of volatility, and indeed one of the things we saw was 2 rounds of rather ugly, overt combat taking place in Kinshasa related to the 2006 elections. So I don't see the same kinds of threats to stability, at least at this point, arising out of the elections per se. This is not to be dismissive of any of the ongoing security issues, the ongoing problems of the East, the armed groups, the FDLR, the LRA, ADF, and various Congolese groups, and other issues. But and there are lots of issues related to the elections. I do not regard an overall threat to stability in the Congo as being one of the chief ones, at least at this point. Potentially related to that was the question about President Kabila's view. I guess I would note having an incumbent in office being anxious about elections is not a unique phenomenon to Congo. I won't make any reference to the city in which we're sitting, but or others. But I do know from both private and public discussions, President Kabila and other senior members of the government as well have reiterated a very strong and unequivocal commitment to not only the recognition of the importance of credible elections, but to them being held this year. He has stated that publicly, and I can tell you that in private conversations, at least in which I've been involved, that's been very much consistent and without qualification. As I mentioned earlier, there's lots of complications here technically in terms of just being able to get everything done in a very tight election calendar, but that's a somewhat different issue. That's a technical one of getting things implemented. I am not overly concerned at this point in terms of a commitment of having the elections this year and of a recognition of the importance of a credible democratic election exercise. Obviously, there's lots of time. We have to watch developments, but that's as I see it at this point. The question about security sector reform, of course, today's discussion was not focused on security. It is, again, a topic in which I could easily present at least 5 different presentations lasting long periods of time on security issues and security sector reform. It is big, it is complicated. Let me just try to make a couple of observations. First of all, as a probably minority view, but I have a somewhat jaundiced view at this point of talking or trying to talk about security sector reform as an overall whole. I saw a paper that was drafted shortly after I arrived in July. That was again the conceptual paper of principles for security sector reform. And my first reaction, frankly, when I read it was, I've signed this paper before. All I have to do is find the one I signed as American ambassador, cross out my old total, write in my new one, and we're fine. But that paper and those ideas and those agreements haven't led to very much. In all of these years, the actual progress in some of the fundamental parts of security sector reform haven't gone very far. And the progress has been, in my opinion, entirely unsatisfactory, and I don't think I'm alone in that. So if that's the case, maybe my thinking is we should be thinking of a somewhat different approach to this. And then from that I started thinking, well, when we're talking about security sector reform, what do we have? We have lots of issues within the military arena. And when you talk about BOSCO and so on, a lot of that is the military alone. And when many people talk about security sector reform, what they're really thinking is the military. But there's also police, and police are a very important part, a very essential, critical part for long-term stability, and one in which we are trying to do more as well in terms of providing a greater capability and professionalization of the Congolese National Police. And those programs do not have to be integrally linked with things that are going on in the military sector. And then, as I've already mentioned, there are justice systems, civilian and military, as well as related prison issues. Those, too, are very important and critical to move forward, but aren't inherently linked to, again, military or even, to a significant extent, the police program. So perhaps we should try to focus in practical terms on a more sectoral approach in terms of seeing what can be done in each of these areas. And each of them are big and complicated by themselves. And even within the military, you have lots of different issues. You have an overall professionalization. You have integration of armed groups. You have demobilization and reintegration to the community of ex-combatants. You have human rights training. You have military professionalization per se, etc. Restructuring of the FARDC. Lots of things. Each of which is a big, complicated topic in and of itself. And I think it is possible to achieve progress at a significantly greater rate in many, if not all, of these areas. But instead of necessarily always trying to talk about this whole giant thing at once, I think it was an old Alka-Seltzer ad that said, "I can't believe I ate the whole thing." Perhaps we shouldn't try to eat the whole thing at once, but instead be trying to focus on a more manageable sectoral approach to move forward. And I think there's prospects there. I certainly have been having very active discussions with other international partners, with senior Congolese, with ministers that occupy key positions. How can we do this better? What can we do to achieve the results that are needed for the Congo and produce the kind of conditions that are conducive to long-term stability? And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I have the ultimate blueprint or answers to provide, but I think that we are moving up on some useful answers that will at least provide a basis for more and better than we have seen in the last 10 years. And when I say that, I am not being critical of anybody in the past. I myself was a part of those efforts, and I don't think they have produced the results that we wanted, and certainly insufficient for what are the needs. I might add there are a couple of related issues. Bilateral training programs, military training programs, speaking of military alone, are important, and I give full credit to those countries who are engaged, but they are frankly not sufficient. If you add them all up together, they do not amount to the total level of training that is needed to accomplish the kind of objectives for a more professional and more capable FARDC. So I would like to encourage, and do encourage, those countries or others who are involved in military training programs to at least maintain, and it is not at all clear they will be maintained, including U.S. military training programs, if not expand, and it really needs to be expanded. But it is hard to find the resources to do that, but it's important. Police training I've already mentioned. We have undertaken, we recently started a 6-month long-term training program for 500 newly integrated Congolese police. These are coming out of the east from demobilized elements that were part of armed groups to be integrated into the police with a 6-month training program to help professionalize and make them capable police. But this is just, again, a start, and we need a lot more involvement and support from other countries. This one, by the way, is largely being supported by Japanese cooperation agency funding, and we're actively in the hunt for more resources to do that as well. Much more is needed. Part of it is a resource question, but I think part of it is how we approach it and interact with the Congolese to be able to get to objectives. But it's a critically important issue, and I could easily sit here for an hour, but I think you would be unhappy if I did talking about it, so I'll stop there. So.
Well, actually, that's one I could pitch in on too, if I could be so presumptuous, because there's a lot of thinking outside the box now on this, and the Woodrow Wilson Center's Africa program, for instance, has just been contracted by the State Department to do some of the kind of collaborative training, cohesive leadership training that we did with the military in Burundi in the Congo, with the high command elements. And one of the elements of that, of course, is bringing also civilians in who have military responsibilities. It's not just working with the commanders themselves, but including people from the Kivus and others out of the command elements there. So there's a scattergun thinking here about how to approach it. It's not just all professional competence and human rights training, etc.
Quite so.
We are getting close to time, but I've been told we can take an extra couple of minutes, so we'll take maybe 2 more questions. One right in front here.
Herbert.
No, not yet, Herbert.
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. Herbert Weiss of this center. Following up on the whole security sector reform question, is it correct that one of the problems in the past, when bilateral arrangements were made to train battalions of Congolese army, that the follow-up included the distribution of members of those battalions across the board to other units, and that the great value that was supposedly achieved by keeping those troops together for a long time and giving them the training and creating esprit de corps and all of that was lost because of those decisions, which were command decisions by the Congolese military. If this is correct, and I'm sure you have 10 times the information that I have about that, does it not pose the question as to whether the highest level of the regime really wants efficient battalions? I could take that several steps further, but I won't.
I think we know the crux of the question. One more. If I don't see an immediate hand, we're going to answer that one as the last one. Okay, Roger?
You do invite me to spend an hour talking about security. The first part of that, is it true that at least most, not all, of the trained integrated battalions, the integrity of those as discrete units has been broken up? The short answer is yes. I was not around during at least some of the time when these decisions were taken, so I'm not well placed, at least in terms of first-hand knowledge, to say why or what exactly happened. But there are at least 2 battalions that do exist at this point as trained, integrated, different countries. But others have largely been broken up. I, however, would submit that from the current environment, without trying to address, as I say, I wasn't present firsthand when these decisions, I don't think decisions were necessarily taken from any standpoint of wanting to have a weak FARDC or a weakened force, but rather, again, I refer back to what I was alluding to earlier as political considerations, as various other currents that were flowing that led to these decisions, and much of what we see right now. My own sense is that the Congolese government collectively, specifically President Kabila, but the government generally, wants and needs and recognizes that it needs a capable, functioning army to be able to defend itself. I mean, obviously, most Congolese will acknowledge in some way or another the pain that has been felt by 2 invasions and the utter inability of the FAS originally, and the poor performance of the subsequent Congolese army in the wars that took place. And they would like a capability to not have this as an ongoing and recurring feature of the country. How you do that is difficult. There are some, to be fair, there are some competing currents that are felt from some of the international partners in terms of how to proceed and what to do. These are not done with a completely unified voice. There has certainly been an effort to varying degrees of success among many of the Western players and with South Africa to coordinate their programs, at least to some degree. The Angolan training that occurred, not so much, in my opinion, and that now isn't an ongoing thing. The Chinese activities, not really coordinated in the past at all, so you have this as an element as well. And then, of course, the very complicated domestic environment in which you're familiar with, and many people are. It is not an easy question. There has been a recent promotion list put out of sub-general officer level of the FARDC. And analyzing this is a very interesting exercise, and trying to figure out exactly where everything came from. But it's illuminating in terms of trying to address the kind of question that you're asking. Why is this, and where did it come from, and what are we seeing where? Eventually, I anticipate there will be a corresponding list at the general officer level that in some ways will be even more interesting, potentially, to look at. And there is prospectively some significant restructuring of the FARDC command hierarchy, particularly in the East, structurally, not just in terms of individuals. That will also be interesting. But I think there is an interest in trying to build a capable professional army that can exercise its role. I might also add, in terms of the human rights abuses and problems, certainly it is my view that these occur disproportionately from a lot of the integrated elements that have been brought in from various armed groups, again, without adequate training, because there isn't enough training available, and so you tend to magnify the abuses that are committed. The integration is a needed component of addressing demobilization or eliminating armed groups, but it does create other problems in terms of building a capable FARDC army. And I think it is fair to say that there are certainly senior officers of the FARDC that are unhappy in having to integrate various untrained armed elements into the army, and the complications that creates as well. All of which is part of the equation. I don't think there are easy answers. And again, I think it is important that we have an ongoing active dialogue, but I would emphasize a dialogue. Too often this has the tendency to turn into monologues or lecturing, and that is not productive. But we need to have an ongoing active dialogue with the key officials, both military and civilian, in the defense and security arenas, to be able to get to the kind of improvement and objective. And again, I don't pretend to sit here and have the magic slate of answers myself, but it's something that we need to be able to continue to talk about to get to the kind of results that we want, both in terms of a capable army professionally, but one that is also performing properly in terms of a role in a democracy, human rights observance, and also the various elements of integration and getting to, again, conditions of long-term stability for the country and particularly in the East.
Well, I wish we could go into that more because the role of the police would be very important too, particularly in the upcoming election.
And the police, critical importance, and I'm encouraged with a lot of what I'm seeing, and perhaps I'm not objective, but we organized a visit not too long ago by the Vice Prime Minister, Minister of the Interior, some other senior officials, and some international donors up to the Kapalata Training Center where we're doing this long-term training. And what we saw, I thought, was very good, and I think a number of people were impressed. Part of my motive, I confess, was to encourage some of those donors to try to inspire them to become more engaged in support for police training. I was struck by one of the demonstrations of the trainees going after a bad guy driving in town. That the criminal in question, as he drove into the area where the demonstration was being done, was in compliance with UN regulations, wearing his seatbelt. And somebody suggested to me that was what immediately drew the attention of the authorities, because anybody driving in Kinshasa with a seatbelt clearly is up to something.
Well, I'm also sure the donors saw through your motivation. Well, join me in thanking Ambassador Meese. A wonderful presentation. We appreciate your frankness, your openness, and giving us so much time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity.